The water is black, not the gentle black of a peaceful night, but the black of burning oil, the black of death itself. A small figure clings desperately to a piece of wood floating among the wreckage. White paws grip the makeshift raft with surprising strength. Black fur is plastered against a small, shivering body. Around him, the Atlantic Ocean roars with the fury of war unleashed. 50,000 tons of steel are sinking beneath the waves in a cacophony of groaning metal and exploding ammunition. The pride of the German Navy is dying a violent death in these freezing waters, and somehow, impossibly, against every law of nature and probability, a cat is still alive. His name will become legend. They will call him Unsinkable Sam. But right now, in this precise moment of May 27th, 1941, he is just a terrified animal trying to survive in water cold enough to kill a grown man in less than 30 minutes. The waves tower above him like moving mountains. Each one threatens to be his last, to drag him down into the freezing depths where so many sailors have already perished. The oil burns his eyes and coats his fur, making every movement harder, every breath more difficult. His small heart pounds like a war drum inside his chest, but he does not let go of that piece of wood. He will not let go, because this cat, this seemingly ordinary tuxedo cat with white paws and a black coat, possesses something extraordinary, something that defies explanation, something that will carry him through 3 separate naval disasters in less than 6 months. The will to survive. But let us go back. Let us go back to understand how this incredible story truly began. 6 months earlier, life was different for our protagonist. The cat we now call Sam had a home, not a comfortable home by civilian standards, but a home nonetheless aboard the mighty Bismarck, the newest, most powerful battleship in the German Kriegsmarine. This was a floating fortress armed with 8 massive 380mm guns, 50,000 tons of armored steel, the very symbol of German naval supremacy and technological prowess. And somewhere in the bowels of this mechanical giant, among the engine rooms and ammunition stores, among the networks of pipes and cables that kept this beast alive, a small black and white cat went about his duties with quiet efficiency. His job was simple but vital. Hunt the rats that threatened the food supplies stored in the ship's hold. Keep the vermin away from the cables and equipment that could be damaged by their gnawing teeth. Be the silent guardian of hygiene in the cramped quarters where hundreds of men lived and worked. Sailors have brought cats aboard ships for centuries, not out of sentimentality, but out of practical necessity. A good ship's cat was worth its weight in gold, and this particular cat, whose German name we will never know, was very good at his job. He moved through the shadows of the Bismarck like a ghost, appearing and disappearing at will, his tuxedo coat making him blend perfectly with the play of light and shadow in the ship's interior. The sailors liked him. In the brutal world of naval warfare, where men lived in constant awareness that death could come at any moment from torpedo or shell, a cat represented something else. Something warm, something alive, something that reminded them of home, of normal life, of the world that existed beyond the steel walls of their floating prison. They would sneak him scraps from their meals. They would scratch behind his ears when they passed him in the corridors. They would smile when they saw him curled up in some impossible place, sleeping with the absolute confidence that only cats possess. He became part of the ship's soul, as much a member of the crew as any sailor. But the Bismarck was not built for peaceful voyages. This ship was a weapon, designed for one purpose only, to dominate the seas and destroy Allied shipping. In May of 1941, the order came. Operation Rheinübung, Exercise Rhine. The Bismarck, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, would break out into the Atlantic Ocean and wreak havoc on the British convoy routes that kept Britain alive and fighting. It was a bold plan, A dangerous plan, a plan that would end in catastrophe. Our cat knew nothing of grand strategy or military operations. He knew only that the ship's engines began to rumble differently, that the motion changed, that the men around him became tense and focused. The Bismarck left port and headed north, threading through the narrow passages between Norway and Scotland, trying to slip past the British naval patrols. But the British were watching. They were always watching. And when the Bismarck was spotted, every available ship in the Royal Navy was ordered to hunt her down and sink her. The chase lasted for days. The Bismarck fought off her pursuers with devastating effectiveness at first. In the Battle of the Denmark Strait, her guns found the pride of the British Navy, the battle cruiser HMS Hood. A single salvo struck the Hood's ammunition magazine. The explosion was apocalyptic. The Hood, which had seemed invincible, broke in half and sank in less than 3 minutes. Out of a crew of over 1,400 men, only 3 survived. The British were shocked, horrified, and filled with a burning desire for revenge. Every ship that could reach the area was sent after the Bismarck. Battleships, cruisers, aircraft carriers, destroyers, they all converged on one target. The German ship tried to escape, racing toward the safety of French ports, where German air cover could protect her. But the British were relentless. On May 26th, torpedo bombers from the aircraft carrier Ark Royal attacked through terrible weather. One torpedo struck the Bismarck's rudder, jamming it and making the ship unable to steer properly. She was crippled, doomed, circling helplessly in the cold Atlantic waters. The British fleet closed in for the kill, and our cat, deep inside the ship, felt the change. The engines that had been his constant companion for months were stuttering, struggling. The ship was listing, tilting at strange angles. The men were running, shouting, their voices filled with panic and desperation. May 27th dawned with terrible weather. Force 8 seas, driving rain, thick fog. The water temperature was hovering around 4 degrees Celsius. At this temperature, a human being could survive perhaps 20 minutes, maybe 30, if they were exceptionally lucky and strong. The British battleships King George V and Rodney opened fire at dawn. Their shells, massive projectiles weighing as much as a small car, began to rain down on the Bismarck. The sound was beyond description. Each hit was like 1,000 thunderstorms concentrated into a single moment. The ship's superstructure began to disintegrate. Fires broke out everywhere. The brave German crew fought back desperately, but the Bismarck's main guns had been damaged. She could barely fight anymore. She could only die. Inside the ship, it was hell. Explosions rocked the hull. Bulkheads collapsed. Steam pipes ruptured, filling compartments with scalding vapor. Men were thrown against walls. The lights flickered and died. In the darkness and chaos, our cat moved with instinct, not thought. He fled from the fires, from the steam, from the screaming metal. He climbed upward, always upward, toward fresh air, toward light, toward any chance of survival. Around him, sailors were doing the same, abandoning ship as their floating home was systematically destroyed. The British ships fired over 2,800 shells at the Bismarck. Torpedoes slammed into her hull, but the great ship refused to sink. Her armor was too strong, her construction too solid. In the end, her own crew had to scuttle her, opening the sea valves to let the ocean in. At 10:40 in the morning, the Bismarck rolled over and sank. Imagine the scene. A massive warship, longer than 2 football fields, slipping beneath the waves. Hundreds of men in the water, crying out for help that would not come in time. Debris everywhere, wooden planks, life rafts, pieces of equipment, oil spreading across the surface like a toxic blanket. And somewhere in this apocalyptic scene, a small, black and white cat, paddling frantically, searching for anything that would float, anything that would keep him above the killing cold of the water. He found a piece of wood, probably part of a deck plank, and he climbed onto it with his remaining strength. And there he stayed, shivering, soaked, terrified, but alive. The cold should have killed him in minutes. The oil should have poisoned him. The waves should have swept him away. But he clung to that wood with a determination that defied nature itself. Hours passed. The British ships searched for survivors, but there were so few. Out of a crew of over 2,100 men on the Bismarck, only 114 were pulled from the water alive. Most died from hypothermia before they could be rescued. And then, in the afternoon, hours after the sinking, a lookout on the British destroyer HMS Cossack spotted something strange among the debris, a small dark shape on a piece of wood. At first, they thought it might be an illusion, a trick of the eyes in the chaotic seascape. But as they drew closer, they realized what they were seeing. A cat, a living, breathing cat, floating in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of the ship that had tried to kill them all just hours before. The sailors of the Cossack could not believe their eyes. This was impossible. Nothing this small should have survived. They carefully maneuvered their ship closer and pulled the cat aboard with a rescue net. The cat was in terrible condition, soaked to the bone, covered in oil, shaking with cold. But he was alive, and more than that, he was calm, remarkably calm. As the British sailors cleaned him up, dried him off, and gave him warm milk, he did not panic or lash out. He simply accepted their help with a dignity that seemed almost human. The sailors were amazed. They had just fought the most intense naval battle of their lives. They had sunk the most powerful enemy ship afloat, and now they were taking care of a German cat, a survivor of the ship they had destroyed. It seemed absurd, surreal, a tiny moment of mercy and compassion in the midst of total war. They decided to keep him. They decided to make him their own. And they gave him a new name, Oscar. In the International Maritime Signal Code, the letter O, represented by the flag Oscar, means man overboard. It was perfect. This cat was literally a man, or rather a feline, overboard. And now he had a new home, a new crew, a new life. But here is where the story becomes complicated, where the conflict of values begins to emerge. The HMS Cossack was not a luxury cruise liner. This was a tribal-class destroyer, a warship designed for one purpose, to fight and destroy enemy vessels. Space was at a premium. Every cubic inch of the ship was dedicated to weapons, ammunition, fuel, or the bare minimum needed to keep the crew alive. There was no room for pets, no budget for extra mouths to feed, no official place for a cat in the Royal Navy's regulations. Some of the officers were not happy. They argued that Oscar was a distraction, a waste of resources, a violation of naval protocol. They pointed out that keeping an animal on a warship was unhygienic, potentially dangerous, and completely unnecessary. They wanted him put ashore at the first opportunity. Leave him at a port, give him to a local family, get him off the ship. But the crew had other ideas. The common sailors, the men who actually ran the ship and fought the battles, they wanted Oscar to stay. They had developed a bond with this little survivor. They saw him as a good luck charm, a living symbol of their victory over the Bismarck. They argued that cats had served on ships since the dawn of sailing. They caught rats. They boosted morale. They were part of naval tradition. A compromise was reached, uneasy and unofficial. Oscar could stay, but he had to earn his keep. He had to do his job as a ship's cat, hunt the rats, stay out of the way during combat operations, not cause any problems. The crew agreed enthusiastically. They would make sure Oscar behaved. They would take care of him. He would not be a burden. And so Oscar became a member of the crew of HMS Cossack, the only German veteran serving on a British warship. The irony was not lost on anyone. This cat had sailed under the swastika. He had lived on the ship that sank the Hood and killed over 1,400 British sailors. And now he was living with the men who had sunk his first home. War makes strange bedfellows indeed. Oscar adapted to his new life with remarkable ease. He learned the routines of the Cossack. He learned where the rats hid in the cargo holds. He learned which sailors would give him the best scraps from their meals. He learned to sleep through the sound of the ship's guns firing during drills. And he learned to stay calm, always calm, even when the ship went into battle. The sailors noticed this. They noticed that while they were tense and nervous before combat, Oscar would simply find a quiet corner and sleep, or sit and groom himself with complete indifference to the chaos around him. It was unnatural. It was eerie. It was also strangely comforting. If the cat was calm, maybe everything would be all right. Maybe they would survive this battle too. Some sailors began to see Oscar as more than just a mascot. They began to see him as a talisman, a protective spirit, the cat who had survived the Bismarck, the cat who had floated for hours in water that killed men in minutes. Surely such a creature was blessed, protected by forces beyond human understanding. Surely having him on board would keep them safe. But other sailors were less superstitious and more practical. They simply enjoyed Oscar's company. In the long hours between battles, when the ship was on patrol, and there was nothing to do but wait and watch the empty ocean, Oscar provided entertainment and companionship. He would play with bits of rope that the sailors dangled for him. He would curl up in their laps while they wrote letters home. He would follow them around during their duties, supervising their work with the imperious air that only cats can manage. He became part of the fabric of life aboard the Cossack, as natural and necessary as the morning watch or the evening meal. And then, in quiet moments, usually late at night, when most of the crew was asleep, individual sailors would sit with Oscar and talk to him. They would tell him about their fears, their hopes, their memories of home. They would tell him things they could not say to their fellow sailors, because to speak of fear or homesickness or doubt was seen as weakness. But a cat does not judge. A cat simply listens, purrs, and provides comfort through its presence. Oscar became a confessor, a therapist, a silent friend to men who desperately needed one. For several months, life continued this way. The Cossacks sailed the seas, escorting convoys, hunting submarines, fighting the eternal battle to keep the Atlantic sea lanes open. Oscar performed his duties, caught his rats, and won more hearts among the crew. Officers who had initially opposed keeping him began to soften. Even the ship's captain was seen scratching Oscar behind the ears on occasion. It seemed that this strange little survivor had found his place, had found his purpose. He was home, but fate, cruel and inexorable, had other plans. In October of 1941, the Cossack was assigned to escort convoy HG 75, a group of merchant ships traveling from Gibraltar back to Britain. These convoys were vital to Britain's survival. They carried food, fuel, raw materials, everything needed to keep the island nation fighting, and they were hunted relentlessly by German submarines, the feared U-boats that prowled the Atlantic like wolves. On October 24th, the convoy was approximately 600 miles west of Gibraltar, moving through dark waters under a cloudy sky. The Cossack was on the convoy's flank, her sonar operators listening intently for the telltale ping that would indicate a submarine nearby. Oscar was below decks, probably sleeping in one of his favorite spots near the engine room where it was warm. At approximately 4 a.m, disaster struck. The German submarine U-563 had been stalking the convoy for hours, waiting for the perfect moment to attack. The submarine's commander lined up his shot and fired a single torpedo from a range of about 900 meters. The torpedo was a G7A, an electric model that left no wake of bubbles to betray its approach. Silent, invisible, deadly. It struck the Cossack on her port side, directly beneath the forward gun mounting. The explosion was catastrophic. Think about what happens when a torpedo detonates. This is not like a bomb that explodes in the air. A torpedo explodes underwater against the hull of a ship. The force of the blast is channeled by the water, concentrated, amplified. The pressure wave can rupture metal plates half an inch thick, as if they were paper. The heat can melt steel, and the water that rushes in through the hole moves with the force of a tidal wave. The entire forward section of the Cossack, everything ahead of the bridge, was blown apart. The bows separated from the rest of the ship. Men sleeping in the forward compartments died instantly, either from the blast itself or from the water that flooded in within seconds. The ship's structure groaned and screamed as metal twisted and broke. Alarms blared. Emergency lights flickered on in the sudden darkness. And the ship began to list, tilting forward as water poured into the gaping wound in her hull. The surviving crew scrambled to their damage control stations. They sealed bulkheads, trying to contain the flooding. They started pumps to remove water. They fought desperately to save their ship. And in the chaos and the darkness and the cold sea water rising through the lower decks, Oscar once again had to run for his life. He scrambled upward through tilted corridors, through ankle-deep water that was rising every second. He dodged panicked sailors. He leaped over equipment that had broken loose and was sliding across the deck. His instincts, honed by his previous disaster, guided him toward safety, toward the upper decks, toward fresh air and escape routes. The Cossack did not sink immediately. Her crew's damage control efforts kept her afloat, barely. But she was crippled, helpless, unable to defend herself if another attack came. Other ships from the convoy gathered around her, forming a protective screen while desperate efforts were made to save her. They tried to tow her toward Gibraltar, but the damage was too severe. The ship was taking on water faster than the pumps could remove it. The order was given to abandon ship. 159 men had died in the torpedo explosion and its immediate aftermath. The survivors prepared to leave their ship, their home, the metal structure that had protected them through so many battles. And once again, Oscar found himself in the water. Whether he jumped or was washed overboard or was deliberately placed in a lifeboat by a sailor who remembered to save the cat, we do not know for certain. Historical records are unclear on this detail. But what we do know is that Oscar survived the sinking of the Cossack, survived his second naval disaster in less than 6 months, survived his second immersion in the cold Atlantic Ocean. The survivors were picked up by other ships. Oscar was found among them, wet, bedraggled, probably, terrified, but alive, still alive. The sailors who rescued him were astonished. They knew his story. Word had spread through the fleet about the cat who had survived the Bismarck. And now he had survived the Cossack too. 2 ships, 2 sinkings, 1 cat. What were the odds? What kind of luck, good or bad, did this animal carry with him? The superstitious began to whisper. Maybe Oscar was not a good luck charm. Maybe he was the opposite. Maybe he was cursed. Maybe every ship he sailed on was doomed to sink. Maybe it would be better to leave him ashore, to end this streak of disasters before it could continue. But Oscar had defenders too. They pointed out that the Bismarck and the Cossack had been sunk by enemy action, not by bad luck or curses. The cat had nothing to do with the battles that destroyed his homes. He was just an innocent victim of war, a small creature caught up in forces far beyond his control or comprehension. And besides, they argued, look at the facts. Oscar had survived both sinkings. He had survived conditions that killed strong, grown men. Surely that proved he was blessed, not cursed. Surely having him aboard brought protection, not doom. The debate raged among the sailors, but in the end it did not matter, because Oscar's next assignment had already been decided by forces higher up the command chain. The cat who had survived the Bismarck and the Cossack was transferred to another ship, and not just any ship. He was sent to the HMS Ark Royal, one of the most famous aircraft carriers in the Royal Navy, the ship whose torpedo bombers had crippled the Bismarck and made her destruction possible. The irony was almost poetic. Oscar was going to serve on the ship that had avenged the Hood by dooming the Bismarck. He was going to live on the ship that had, in a sense, created him by making him a survivor. The Ark Royal was a completely different environment from the Cossack. This was a massive ship, a floating airfield with over 1,600 crew members. There was space here, lots of space. There were hangars for aircraft, workshops for maintenance, storage areas for fuel and ammunition. Oscar found himself in a new world, larger and more complex than anything he had known before. The crew welcomed him enthusiastically. His reputation had preceded him. Everyone wanted to meet the legendary Unsinkable Sam, though at this point in late October 1941, he had not yet earned that famous nickname officially. He was still just Oscar, the survivor cat, the feline with 9 lives who seemed determined to use them all. The pilots liked him especially. These men, who flew outdated fairy swordfish biplanes into combat against modern German fighters, who faced death every time they took off from the carrier's deck, they understood survival against impossible odds. They saw Oscar as a kindred spirit. The air crews adopted him as their unofficial mascot. They would pet him for luck before missions. They would bring him treats from the officers' mess. They would tell him about their flights, their fears, their victories. For a few weeks, it seemed like Oscar had finally found a safe home. The Ark Royal was a powerful ship, well defended, considered by many to be unsinkable. She had survived numerous attacks already. She had a reputation for being lucky, for always making it back to port no matter what the enemy threw at her. Surely Oscar would be safe here. Surely his string of disasters had ended. But the universe, it seems, has a dark sense of humor. On November 13th, 1941, the Ark Royal was returning to Gibraltar after a mission delivering aircraft to Malta. The Mediterranean Sea was relatively calm, the weather was good, spirits were high, the ship was only 30 miles from Gibraltar, almost home, almost safe. And then, at 4:41 in the afternoon, a single torpedo from the German submarine U-81 struck the Ark Royal on her starboard side. The explosion was massive, but not immediately catastrophic. The Ark Royal was a large, well-built ship with extensive compartmentalization and damage control systems. The crew went to work immediately, fighting to save their vessel. They sealed bulkheads. They started pumps. They organized bucket brigades. For hours it seemed like they might succeed. The ship stayed afloat. She did not capsize. Tugboats came out from Gibraltar to help tow her to safety. But as the hours passed, the situation deteriorated. The Ark Royal began to list more severely. Water continued to flood compartments that should have been sealed. The pumps could not keep up. Electrical systems began to fail. The list reached 20 degrees, an angle so severe that walking on the decks became difficult. Equipment began to slide and fall. Aircraft broke loose from their tie-downs in the hangar and crashed into bulkheads. The damage control teams fought valiantly, but they were losing the battle. Finally, after more than 12 hours of struggle, the order was given to abandon ship. This time, unlike the sudden catastrophic sinkings of the Bismarck and the Cossack, there was time to evacuate properly. Time to gather personal belongings. Time to make sure everyone got off safely. And time to find Oscar. Sailors searched through the tilting corridors of the doomed carrier looking for their cat. They found him, according to historical accounts, on one of the motor launches, the small boats used to ferry personnel between ships. He had apparently made his way there on his own, once again demonstrating an uncanny instinct for survival. When they pulled him onto the rescue boat, witnesses reported that he looked angry, not scared, not panicked, but genuinely irritated, as if he could not believe this was happening again, as if he was personally offended that another one of his ships was sinking beneath him. The image is almost comical, a wet, annoyed cat glaring at the sailors around him with an expression that clearly said, "Not this again." But he was unhurt, completely unhurt. For the third time, Oscar had survived a naval disaster that killed human beings around him. For the third time, he had escaped from a dying ship. For the third time, he had beaten the odds. The Ark Royal finally capsized and sank early on the morning of November 14th, less than 30 miles from the safety of Gibraltar Harbour. Only one member of her crew died in the sinking, a remarkably low casualty count that spoke to the professionalism and training of the Royal Navy. But that one death was one too many, and it reminded everyone that even in an orderly evacuation, war is deadly, unpredictable, and cruel. Oscar was brought to Gibraltar, along with the rest of the Ark Royal's survivors. And it was here, in the British fortress at the mouth of the Mediterranean, that the Admiralty made a decision. This cat had survived the sinking of 3 major warships in less than 6 months. The Bismarck in May, the Cossack in October, the Ark Royal in November, 3 ships totaling well over 70,000 tons of warship, 3 different navies if you counted his German origins, hundreds of men dead, thousands of tons of steel resting on the ocean floor, and one cat, still alive, still healthy, still apparently blessed or cursed by forces beyond human understanding. The Admiralty declared that Oscar was too precious to risk on the front lines any longer. Whether they meant this literally, that he was a valuable morale symbol who should be preserved, or whether they were genuinely worried that he might be carrying some kind of curse that would doom any ship he sailed on, the records do not say. But the order was clear. Oscar would not serve on another warship. He would remain on land for the rest of the war. He was assigned to the office of the Governor of Gibraltar, where he would live out his days in safety and comfort, far from the torpedoes and bombs that had tried so hard to kill him. The sailors who had served with him were disappointed but understanding. They had grown to love this strange, calm, unsinkable cat. But they also recognized that perhaps it was time for his luck, good or bad, to stop being tested. Oscar had earned his retirement, and it was also at this point that Oscar received his final official nickname. The British Admiralty, with their love of formal titles and proper recognition, bestowed upon him the name that would echo through history. Unsinkable Sam. It was perfect. It captured everything about his story, the impossibility of his survival, the dark humor of sailors facing death, the stubborn refusal to give up even when all hope seems lost. Unsinkable Sam became famous, not just in Gibraltar, not just in the Royal Navy, but throughout Britain. Newspapers ran stories about him. He became a symbol of British resilience during the darkest days of the war. If a small cat could survive 3 naval disasters, surely Britain could survive. Hitler's onslaught. The propaganda value was obvious, and it was exploited fully. But there was something deeper there too, something more genuine. People needed hope in 1941. They needed to believe that survival was possible, that luck existed, that sometimes the impossible could happen. An artist named Georgina Shaw Baker was commissioned to create a portrait of Unsinkable Sam. She worked in pastels, creating a remarkably lifelike image of the cat sitting calmly, his tuxedo coat clean and groomed, his eyes alert and intelligent. The portrait captured something essential about Sam, his dignity, his composure, the sense that this was not just an animal, but a personality, a character, someone who had seen things and survived them and carried the memory in his calm, knowing gaze. The portrait was later donated to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, where it remains today, a small piece of history, a reminder of a time when a cat became a legend. But what about Sam? Himself? What was his life like after the war ended? The historical records become sparse here. We know that he remained in Gibraltar for a while, living in comfort, probably getting fat on the scraps provided by the governor's staff. He was no longer a working cat. He was a retiree, a veteran, a living piece of history. Eventually, Sam was sent to Belfast in Northern Ireland, to a home for retired sailors. Even in his final years, he remained among the men who understood him, who shared his experiences of life at sea. He lived there quietly, peacefully, far from the sound of guns and the smell of burning oil. He lived there until 1955, when he finally died of old age. He was probably about 14 years old, a good long life for a cat, especially one who had survived what he had survived. He was buried with honors, though the exact location of his grave has been lost to time. But his memory lives on, his story lives on, and that portrait at the National Maritime Museum remains, a testament to the incredible, improbable, impossible tale of the cat who would not die. So what can we take from this story? What does it mean, beyond the simple facts of a lucky cat who survived 3 shipwrecks? I think it tells us something profound about survival, about resilience, about the refusal to give up, even when everything seems hopeless. Sam did not have the advantage of intelligence or planning. He could not understand tactics or strategy. He could not calculate odds or make rational decisions about his best course of action. All he had was instinct, determination, and an absolutely unshakable will to keep living, to keep fighting, to keep clinging to whatever piece of wood or metal or hope he could find. And somehow, impossibly, it was enough. 3 times he faced death. 3 times he survived, not through strength or size or weapons, but through sheer stubborn persistence. There is something deeply inspiring about that. We live in a complex world, full of challenges that can seem overwhelming. We face problems that appear unsolvable. We encounter situations where the odds are stacked impossibly against us, and in those moments it is easy to give up, to surrender, to let the waves pull us under. But Sam's story reminds us that survival is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the best equipped. Sometimes survival is simply about refusing to let go, about holding on when every logical reason says, you should give up, about finding that inner reserve of determination that keeps you afloat even in the coldest, darkest waters. Sam had no special powers. He was not a superhero cat. He was just an ordinary animal who happened to have an extraordinary will to live. And that, perhaps, is the most powerful lesson of all, that the power to survive, to endure, to overcome exists within all of us, if we can just find it and hold on to it tightly enough. Sam's story also reminds us of the strange ways that hope manifests during terrible times. The sailors who saved him, who cared for him, who fought with their officers to keep him aboard, they were not being sentimental fools. They were men facing death every day, men who watched their friends die, who knew that any moment could be their last. And in the midst of that horror, a small cat represented something precious, a connection to normal life, a reminder that not everything in the world was about killing and dying, a living symbol that survival was possible. The officers who wanted to get rid of Sam were not cruel. They were practical, logical, focused on military efficiency. But the sailors who fought to keep him understood something deeper, that morale matters, that hope matters, that sometimes the illogical, impractical, inefficient choice is actually the right choice because it keeps the human spirit alive. And consider the remarkable journey that Sam took, from German ship to British ship to another British ship. He began the war as a German cat, serving the Third Reich. He ended it as a British icon, celebrated throughout the Allied world. He was, in a strange way, the perfect symbol of the chaos and absurdity of war. Nationality meant nothing to him. Ideology meant nothing to him. He was not fighting for Hitler or Churchill or any political cause. He was simply trying to survive, trying to find safety and warmth and food, trying to do his job catching rats wherever he found himself. The war turned him from enemy to ally without him ever understanding or caring about the difference. To Sam, humans were just humans. Some fed him, some cared for him, and all of them lived in these strange floating metal structures that had an unfortunate tendency to explode and sink. The politics were irrelevant. The survival was everything. There is wisdom in that perspective. We humans get caught up in our conflicts, our ideologies, our certainties about who is right and who is wrong. We build walls between us based on nationality, religion, politics, all the categories we use to divide the world into us and them. But from a cat's perspective, from Sam's perspective, all of that is meaningless noise. What matters is compassion. What matters is care. What matters is the sailor who gives you food and scratches your ears, regardless of what flag flies above his ship. Sam did not choose his nationality. He did not volunteer for war. He was simply there, caught up in human conflicts, trying to survive human violence. And the fact that humans on both sides of the conflict cared for him, saved him, valued him, that tells us something important. That even in the midst of total war, even when nations are trying to destroy each other, the capacity for kindness and compassion still exists. The sailor who pulled Sam from the water after the Bismarck sank had every reason to hate anything German. His country was fighting for its life. His friends had died fighting German ships. But when he saw a small cat floating on a piece of wood, he did not see an enemy. He saw a life worth saving. This is not to romanticize war or to pretend that these small acts of mercy somehow make up for the horror and destruction. War is still terrible. Ships still sink. Men still die. The sailor who saved Sam probably killed German sailors in other battles. The complexity and tragedy of war cannot be erased by a feel-good story about a cat. But it can be balanced, slightly, by the recognition that humanity persists even in inhumane conditions, that the same hands that fire guns can also gently dry off a rescued cat, that the same men who drop bombs can also argue with their officers about keeping a mascot. We contain multitudes, we humans. We are capable of great cruelty and great kindness, often within the same day, sometimes within the same hour. Sam's story is a reminder of the kindness, the small acts of decency that persist even when everything else has gone mad. Now, I want you to think about something. Think about the moment when Sam was floating in the Atlantic after the Bismarck sank. It is May 1941. The water is 4 degrees Celsius. A human being would die in this water in less than 30 minutes. Sam is a small cat, much less body mass than a human, much less ability to generate heat. By every reasonable calculation, he should have died in minutes, but he survived for hours. How? What kept him alive? Was it just luck? Was it some biological quirk we do not understand? Or was it something else, something we might call will, determination, the refusal to accept death? I do not know the answer. No one knows. But I find it fascinating that Sam's survival cannot be fully explained by science or statistics. There is something there that defies explanation, something miraculous in the truest sense of the word. A miracle is not necessarily something supernatural. It can simply be something so improbable, so unlikely, that its occurrence seems to violate the normal rules of reality. Sam survived 3 shipwrecks. That is a miracle by any definition. And here is another question worth considering. Did Sam understand what was happening to him? When the Ark Royal began to list, and the sailors were running around in controlled panic, did Sam realize his ship was sinking again? Did he recognize the pattern? Did he feel fear or anger or resignation? Or was each disaster simply a new experience, disconnected from the previous ones in his animal mind? We cannot know. We cannot get inside the consciousness of a cat, especially a cat who died almost 70 years ago. But the witnesses who saw Sam after the Ark Royal sinking reported that he looked angry, not scared, angry, as if he was fed up with this recurring situation, as if he had some awareness that this kept happening to him and he was tired of it. If that observation is accurate, if Sam truly did feel anger rather than fear, then perhaps he did have some understanding of his situation. Perhaps he recognized that he was caught in a pattern of disasters beyond his control. Perhaps he was expressing, in the only way a cat can, his frustration with the universe that kept putting him in danger. I find that image both humorous and deeply moving. An angry cat, glaring at the sailors who rescued him, as if blaming them for the ship sinking. It is funny, because we can all imagine that expression, that look of feline indignation that cat owners know so well. But it is also moving because it suggests that Sam had developed some kind of resilience beyond mere instinct, that he had moved from panic to annoyance, from terror to irritation, that he had, in his own way, learned to cope with disaster by being angry at it rather than afraid of it. Anger can be a survival mechanism. Fear paralyzes. Anger motivates. If Sam truly was angry rather than afraid, that might explain part of his incredible survival rate. He was not freezing in terror. He was actively annoyed and therefore actively fighting to survive, so he could continue being annoyed. The story of Unsinkable Sam has been told and retold over the decades since World War II. It has appeared in books about naval history, in articles about unusual war stories, in websites dedicated to remarkable animals. Each telling emphasizes different aspects of the tale. Some focus on the improbability of the survival. Some focus on the humor of a cat serving on multiple navies. Some focus on the emotional bond between Sam and his various crews. All of these angles are valid. All of them capture something true about the story. But I think the core of the story, the thing that keeps people coming back to it generation after generation, is simpler than any of these specific angles. It is the fundamental human need to believe that survival is possible even in impossible circumstances. We tell stories like Sam's because they give us hope. They remind us that the world is not entirely governed by logic and statistics and probability, that sometimes the impossible happens, that sometimes the small and weak overcome the large and powerful, that sometimes, against all odds, the story has a happy ending. Now, before we finish, I want to address something important. There are skeptics who question whether Sam's story is entirely true. They point out that the historical documentation is incomplete, that some details vary between different accounts, that the story might have been embellished over time for propaganda purposes, or simply because it is a good story, and good stories tend to grow in the telling. These skeptics raise valid points. We should always approach historical accounts, especially extraordinary ones, with appropriate skepticism. But here is what we know for certain. The Bismarck was sunk on May 27th, 1941. The Cossack was torpedoed on October 24th, 1941, and later sank. The Ark Royal was torpedoed on November 13th, 1941, and sank the next day. These are documented historical facts. We also know for certain that a cat was present on at least the Cossack and the Ark Royal, because there are written records from the time mentioning the cat. The portrait by Georgina Shaw Baker exists and is dated to 1941. The portrait is of a specific cat, described in notes as the survivor of multiple sinkings. So the core of the story, that a cat survived multiple naval disasters, is almost certainly true. The specific details, like exactly how long Sam was in the water after the Bismarck, or exactly what expression he had on his face after the Ark Royal, those might be embellished or misremembered, but the essential truth of the story stands up to historical scrutiny, and honestly, even if some details were exaggerated, does it matter? The story of Unsinkable Sam serves a purpose beyond mere historical accuracy. It is a myth in the best sense of the word. A myth is not a lie. A myth is a story that carries truth at a deeper level than mere facts. The myth of Unsinkable Sam tells us that resilience is possible, that survival is achievable, that hope exists even in the darkest times. Whether Sam was in the water for 2 hours or 4 hours after the Bismarck sank does not change the power of that message. Whether he looked angry or scared after the Ark Royal does not diminish the lesson of his story. What matters is that he survived. What matters is that people cared about him. What matters is that his story continues to inspire people 8 decades later. So let me ask you this. What is your Bismarck? What is the disaster in your life that sank your world and left you floating in cold water, clinging to a piece of wood? We all have them. We all face moments when everything falls apart, when the structures we relied on collapse, when we find ourselves in survival mode with no clear path forward. And in those moments, it is easy to give up. It is easy to let the cold water win. But Sam did not give up. He clung to that wood. He waited. He survived. And eventually, rescue came. Not because he was special or chosen or blessed, but because he refused to let go. I am not suggesting that positive thinking or determination alone can solve every problem. Real life is more complicated than that. Sometimes people do everything right and still suffer tragedy. Sometimes the rescue does not come in time. The world is not fair, and survival is not guaranteed. But what Sam's story teaches us is that giving up guarantees failure, while holding on at least gives you a chance. That is not a comfortable message. It is not an easy message, but it is a true message. And here is the final thought I want to leave you with. Sam lived 14 years. He was probably about 8 years old when the war ended in 1945. He had 6 more years of life after that, 6 years of peace and quiet and safety, 6 years of sleeping in the sun, 6 years of being petted and fed and cared for, 6 years where no ships exploded beneath him, where no torpedoes streaked through the water, where no oil fires raged on the ocean surface. Those final 6 years might seem like a footnote to his dramatic story. After all, nothing exciting happened. He just lived a normal cat life. But I would argue that those 6 years are actually the most important part of the story. They are the reward for survival. They are the proof that endurance matters. They are the demonstration that if you can just hold on long enough, if you can just survive the disasters, peace will come eventually. The war will end, the storms will pass, and you will have time, precious time, to rest and heal, and simply exist without constant crisis. That is what we are all ultimately fighting for, is it not? Not glory, not fame, not to be featured in history books, or to have portraits painted of us. We are fighting for the chance to live, to have those quiet, ordinary, peaceful years, to sleep in the sun, to be cared for by people who value us, to reach old age and die naturally, surrounded by warmth and safety. Sam got that. After everything he endured, after all the horror and chaos and near-death experiences, he got to retire. He got to rest. He got his happy ending. And if a small cat who survived the sinking of 3 warships in 6 months can find peace and safety and comfort at the end of his journey, then maybe there is hope for all of us. Maybe our disasters, whatever they are, will also eventually end. Maybe we too will find our quiet place to rest. Maybe we too will survive to see better days. If this story moved you, if it inspired you, if it gave you hope or made you think differently about resilience and survival, then I encourage you to share it. Tell people about Unsinkable Sam. Tell them about the cat who would not die. Tell them that survival is possible even when it seems impossible. The world needs these stories. The world needs reminders that hope exists, that persistence matters, that sometimes the impossible actually happens. And if you want to learn more about naval history, about World War II, about the remarkable stories of animals in wartime, then consider subscribing. There are so many incredible tales waiting to be told, so many moments of courage and compassion and improbable survival, so many lessons hidden in the past waiting to be discovered and shared. Unsinkable Sam is just one story among thousands, but it is a story worth remembering, a story worth preserving, a story worth passing on to future generations. Because as long as we tell these stories, as long as we remember these moments of triumph against impossible odds, hope remains alive. And that, ultimately, is what Sam represents. Not just a lucky cat, but hope itself, unsinkable, eternal, refusing to give up, just like the cat who inspired the legend.